Good evening. Oh. So, so I thought we would start by talking for a couple of minutes about sound and physics, because the reason that these instruments work so amazingly is because the strings are tuned to a certain frequency, and the instrument itself is actually tuned. The parts of the cello vibrate to certain frequencies. I used to have an old Italian cello, and I dropped it one day at the end of a lesson because I was in a hurry, and it cracked. The top cracked in like 2 or 3 places. It was very upsetting. But I took it to Paul Schubeck, and I said, "How do you feel about taking care of this and trying to make it right?" And he said, "Yes, but you have to give me time." So he had the cello probably for close to 3 months. And I went to see him once, and the cello was dismembered. It was like a triage in the operating room. The top of the cello was on this table, and the sides were on that table, and the back was on a different table. And it was upsetting to see it that way. It has a happy ending because that was an amazing instrument, and I was afraid that I had really done something that would take away its sound and its distinctive voice. But once Paul got it all back together and told me I could come in and try it, it sounded like itself. But when I visited him in the shop and I saw the cello all dismembered, he picked up the back of the cello and tapped on it. Now we just hear tap, tap, but when he tapped on it, I heard this note. So he said the parts of a violin or a cello are tuned to certain notes. When they carve them, it's not just that it's structurally nice and it looks good. There's a whole art and science and some wizardry to making the parts of an instrument resonate with one another. Physics. Every object has a frequency. It vibrates at a certain frequency. My shoes have some frequency. All of us have some kind of frequency. Of course, a string instrument has specific frequencies that the 4 strings are tuned to. The top string is A. D, a G, and the low string is C. When I play the A, this whole string is vibrating from here to here. Like if you could see it, the string itself is vibrating. Probably the middle part moves more than the parts at the end. So we're all hearing that note, la, but inside that note are all these other notes that are called harmonics or overtones of the note. And if I put my finger very lightly, exactly halfway up the string, I get a harmonic that's an octave higher, because it's halfway from here to here. So it's making the string vibrate in 2 sections, each of which is half the length of this. It's math. It's just fractions and physics. If I find a place that's a quarter of the length from here to here, then I get a harmonic that's an octave higher than that other one. I can also find it back here because That's a quarter of the length from here to here. So that's already a start. If I go a third of the way up, I get this note. That's an E. It happens to be an E. And because it's a third of the way up, there's another one up here. So when I play this, you're also hearing this and this. If I keep going up, this one, that's how we get the blues. So that's an A also. If I play a D, a low D, I don't know if you hear it, but it's making the D string vibrate in sympathy with it. It's also making the A string vibrate because A is an overtone of D. I don't know if you hear those vibrate. I hear them here. That's why a low D sounds so nice on the cello. And also a low C sounds good because the G's are excited and vibrate in sympathy. If you have an artificial cello, and they're getting better at making these synthesized cello sounds that sort of sound like a cello. I mean, they're getting better at this. Fortunately, they still haven't been able to replicate the sound of an actual acoustic instrument. I say fortunately because that would put a lot of musicians out of work, and it probably already is. I used to have a friend who had an electric cello that was pretty complicated, and he brought it over once, and he set it all up with, he had a console with all these dials, and he set it up so it would have an echo thing, bing, 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 all these effects. And he said, well, now I'm going to set it up another way, but this is really complicated. I said, yeah, go ahead. So he turned all these dials, and he said, okay. I said, so what did you just set it up as? He said, I set it up so it would sound like a cello. And I played it for a minute, and I thought, yeah, that does kind of sound like a cello, but it just made me appreciate what a miraculous invention string instruments are, because they have this amazing resonance and acoustical properties. These days, we usually tune to A440. This is more or less A440. I had played in New York. I was walking through LaGuardia with my cello. This man yelled out at me, "No A440." So I turned it and like, who's yelling "No A440" in the airport? So I had a few minutes before my flight, so I walked over. The guy was in a suit. There was another guy in a suit. I said, why are you yelling "No A440"? He said, come over here. They had a table. They had literature on the table. They had a petition that they were trying to get people to sign to lower the A, to make it a lower A, lower than 440. And it was signed by, among other people, supposedly, Kiri Takano, the great soprano, the great operatic soprano. Well, maybe that's true. Maybe she would be happy if a high C was not as high as the one that she normally had to sing. If you hear people play in a Baroque ensemble, they often tune to a considerably lower A, because in the Baroque time, sometimes the A was considerably lower than the A we use now, the 440. I say sometimes because they still have a lot of organs from the Baroque cathedrals, like in Germany, And if you go around to these, some of them are tuned to like 415, some of them are tuned to 440, like the modern A. Some people think that because of the increasing tension in the world and the faster pace of life on the planet, that's why the A keeps going up and up. So these guys kept, wanting me to sign the petition. I said, they had these magazines called Science Magazine on the table. So I said, well, this is bizarre that you got this petition going. Whom do you represent? And they didn't want to say, but I kept asking them. And finally, they said, Lyndon LaRouche. Now, some of you know this name. He was a corrupt politician in Illinois. He ran for governor. He was a complete crook, Lyndon LaRouche. And he still has some kind of organization going that for some reason was trying to get this petition signed to lower the A, ostensibly. But then I said, so this Science magazine on your table, are you trying to get me to buy that magazine or get a subscription? They said, yes, that would be really good. And I said, well, I'm not going to, but I'll give you a piece of advice. If you're trying to get money from people in the airport, don't go after the musicians because they're not going to have any money. So it was just a bizarre exchange. And, I said to them at one point in the conversation, I said, well, in Holland, the A is like 447, which it is. It's higher there. And they said, in Moscow, it's 450. As if it's a communist plot to raise the A. And if I was a real American, I would sign the petition to lower the A. So I'm tuned to around 440. That's what most people tune to, even like 441, 442. Yes, so I thought I would play first for you a piece that uses a lot of harmonics. I was showing you a bunch of the harmonics. It's called Song of the Birds. It was like a trademark of Pablo Casals, who famously refused to play any solo concerts after the Spanish Civil War because he was protesting the regime of Franco. And so he was very famous, and he would not play solo concerts. And he lived for decades and decades after that and basically refused to play as a protest because Franco outlived him, I think. Casals lived to be 96 years old. But he would once in a while play this piece, Song of the Birds, which was based on a Catalan folk song. That's where he was from. He didn't consider himself a Spaniard. He said, I'm a Catalan. If you ever go to see the Vancouver Symphony, then you see Salvador Brotans, who's the conductor of the Vancouver Symphony in Washington, who's also a Catalan, and really gets mad if you say that he's a Spanish guy. He said, I'm not a Spanish guy, because the Catalan language is a distinct language from Spanish, and yeah, it's a whole culture unto itself, even though it was kind of swallowed up at one point by imperial Spain. That's part of the problem. So I thought I would play Song of the Birds. It's a very short piece. Has a bunch of those harmonics in there. Also, I said tonight I would talk about cello technique. So I'll just say briefly a couple of things. If you move the bow faster, you get more sound. And now I'll move it very slowly. If I play up here near the fingerboard, this is called the fingerboard, not the fretboard. We don't have frets on a guitar, it's the fretboard. The fingerboard, if I play right near the fingerboard, it gets that sound. If I go closer to the bridge, it gets that sound. If I go even closer to the bridge, much more sound, a more intense sound. So already, that's a lot to play with. The bow speed, how close you are to the bridge, and then of course, how much weight you apply to the string, the weight of your arm. Starker used to say, don't press. Don't press the string. Pull the string. Pull the string and push the string, because it vibrates side to side. If I press, it's unpleasant. So I pull the string, and then I push it this way. So that's a lot to play with in terms of how much weight I use. If I use a lot of weight, I get a lot of sound. If I make my arm light and weightless, much softer sound. So, the amount of weight you put on the string, the proximity to the bridge, and the speed of the bow, so it's a lot of variables. So, by way of a very short demonstration of some of these things, I'll play Song of the Birds, which is a beautiful piece that uses a lot of harmonics, and I'll try to show a little bit the choices, the range of sound you can get by changing things about how you're using the bow. Thank you. So, it's a very simple and beautiful song from Catalan folk song, but it always struck me that the piece has like sort of universal meaning and could be from all kinds of different cultures other than Casal's country, Catalonia. It could be a Russian song or a Jewish song or something from the Middle East or South America. Yeah, it's the nature of music sometimes being really closely identified with a certain culture, but breaking down the boundaries, I think, that exist between different cultures and countries, and that's why they say music is the universal language. And you don't have to have studied anything about music theory to completely feel and understand everything that's in a piece of music, I believe. It just speaks to us in a really natural way. That song is in A minor. That's an A. It ends with that note. Or I ended actually on this note, which is a high E, but it's also in A minor. It's in the A minor scale. A minor. A minor has a relative that's a major key, that's C major. So they say keys are relative to one another if they have the same number of sharps and flats. So C major, for example, has no sharps or flats in the key signature. A minor, if I play what's called a natural minor scale, it also has no sharps or flats. So in a way, it leads very naturally into the third Bach suite, which is in C major. As I've mentioned before, Bach was not a cellist. He was a great keyboard player. He was a very skilled violinist, but I don't think that he really played the cello. But he knew what keys would be friendly to the instrument and acoustically successful, you could say. So the third Bach suite is in C major. If I play a C major scale, that's a C, that's a C, and that's another C. The beginning of the third Bach suite is this. So it's just a scale at first, and then he outlines the notes of C major. He could have written it, but what he wrote is better. So I used to play this Bach suite everywhere I went, and I played very often in some assisted living places, and oh boy, and also some facilities for people who were incarcerated in one way or another, maybe because of mental problems. Damish, I don't know if you're familiar with this place, Damish. I don't know if it even still exists. It's Salem. Some people are locked up there because they've shown that they're mentally unstable. So I played there once, and that was actually one of the best audiences I ever played for. I felt like the audience had no filter. maybe because of the state they were in, but I kind of could feel like the music was really getting through. So I used to play this third Bach suite in lots of different places, and I was kind of getting ready to record it. I put it on the second CD I made. And one day I asked myself, well, what is this piece anyway, that first note? What does that first note mean? And I heard a voice say, B. And I said, no, it's a C. Why are you saying that? And then I realized it wasn't the note B, it was the word B-E. It was saying be, that it was like this affirmation of existence. And I thought, well, that's a very nice meaning of the note, and it made sense to me that there's something that's really an affirmation. The whole prelude of the third suite is an exploration of C major and its related keys, and also an exploration of the cello, like what can you do with these four strings in the key of C major and closely related keys. That's enough about it, that's enough analysis. I'll just play the prelude for you, and then we can talk about the rest of the suite. pretty strong statement, the prelude. It kind of puts us in the mood for what's going to follow in the rest of the third Bach suite, which some people have described as a C major as being a muscular key. They say that it's really strong. People assign different qualities and characters to different keys. Certainly on the cello, different keys have different qualities because of the overtones that I talked about. C major is certainly kind to the instrument in a lot of ways. The Allemande that follows the prelude, the music itself is kind of square, if I play it in a really square way. Very good notes. I tried to play it very straightforward way. When I play the piece, I don't really group it in such a square way. I sort of feel this. So it swings a little bit. So it comes around, as opposed to the square way. These pieces have more than one voice, and this rhythm that I just showed you I told you Starker said the most important word in making music was and. So, and so you don't have to give a whole lot of weight to that and note that leads to the next thing. There's a wonderful passage in the Allemande that has like 3 voices in it. Just as a melody, but there's a bass line hidden in there. So that's kind of hidden in there. I think the job of a cellist playing these suites is to kind of delineate these voices so that on some level, conscious or unconscious, you hear that there are 2 or 3 voices going on, and not the same darn sound over and over again with every note getting equal emphasis, which is already hard to do, but it's boring once you do that. It's really boring. So, yeah, well, now I challenge myself. So here's the Allemande. Yes, a nice journey, the Allemande, a nice neighborhood to visit. After the Allemande, in every one of the suites, there's a courante. When I was a kid, first learning this suite, I thought that the notes at the beginning of the courante were all part of the tune. Here are the notes at the beginning of the courante. And then I saw Pablo Casal's masterclass. He said, those are not all the notes of the tune. This is the tune, he said. And he showed that by playing those first two notes bigger and longer, and then the following notes shorter and lighter. Well, that's wonderful. That's so interesting. It sounds like you're having a nice conversation with yourself. And so you hear notes of different voices. Of course, not everybody plays that courante that way. Some people increase the sound as they go down to the bottom. It's what I talked about the other night with the Bach First Suite. It's almost like you can't miss if you use some sort of musical sense and some imagination. The piece is so incredible that it's very hard to spoil it. And you can play it slow, fast, or in between, loud, soft, whatever. All kinds of different styles, and it still holds up as really being a great piece. Having said that, I really took Casal's advice about the nature of the opening of it and try to apply that sort of throughout the courante so that it sounds as if there are more than one voice going on. You need to stand up there. So while I was playing this piece, occasionally my mind went out the window. And so I didn't quite know what I was doing. But I had the experience that I've had many times in my life, that I was not driving the car, but the car kept going straight because my hands knew it, even though my brain was out to lunch. So I said, "Thank you, boys," to my fingers. because they remember. Muscle memory is something that really gets ingrained. So, I mean, it's better if you stay focused, but it's a good thing to know that you can sometimes rely on your body to remember, even when your head is, AWOL. So after the Allemande and the Courante comes the Sarabande, which is the slowest movement in the suites. Maybe I talked the other night when I played the first suite that the Sarabande is viewed as kind of the most lofty and sometimes sort of the most sacred one of the movements of the suite, which all have these dance names. A lot of what happens in the Sarabande of the third suite has to do with dissonance and consonance. When sounds go together very harmoniously, it's called consonant sounds, like these, for example. Or this one. Or even a minor one. But this one, that's a dissonant interval. We all wanted to do this. We all wanted to resolve downward. The first measure of the Sarabande is this. In the Sarabande, there are 3 beats to the measure. A slow measure of 3. And the downbeat is naturally emphasized, as it always is. 1, 2, 3. But in the Sarabande, it's 1, 2, 3. The second beat is often emphasized quite a bit, maybe even more than the downbeat. So that gives it interest. It's not so predictable that the first beat is always the strongest one in the bar. And sometimes Bach brings that out by putting a dissonant sound on the second beat, which creates tension. If we hear a dissonant sound, we want it to resolve. It's just the nature of how we're wired and how these sounds work. A measure or so later in the Sarabande, on the second beat is this. And then, again, a 7th. We all want to hear this. And then we're happy when it resolves. If all the intervals I played were consonant intervals, you would be falling asleep out there. And, there's a very short video from French television that I managed to nab off the internet years and years ago, which shows 2 young monks arguing with a somewhat older monk, because these young monks are tired of only doing what's called the perfect intervals, the unison, the 4th, the 5th, and the octave. That was all the church permitted. I'll play a unison. Two notes of the same pitch. And then an interval of a 4th. Let's see. And then a 5th. And then an octave. that could get tiresome after a while. They're all called the perfect intervals because there's a mathematical kind of order to it. A fourth, if you turn it upside down, it becomes a fifth. And so it's part of this wonderful mathematical order. But it also can get tiresome. And that's the joke of what happens in this video, that these young monks are saying, well, what if we play a sixth? We could sing an interval of a sixth, or even a minor sixth, or a third. I'll play those sixths again. Here's a sixth, a minor sixth, and then there's a third. Also not permitted by the church. And then a minor. And then at the end they say, or even what they call a diminished fifth, otherwise known as a tritone. That's this interval. And the older monk goes, "Ah, diavolo!" and he falls over. Because he's so horrified that they would sing a tritone. It was actually called the devil in sound, the tritone, because it's so dissonant that the church felt like it was bad for people to hear, to be exposed to that interval. So they were trying to monitor what kind of intervals people were exposed to and put them in a certain kind of state and keep them there. But of course, this was in the Renaissance, and then even in the Renaissance, composers started to use all kinds of other harmonies because they got very tired of using just unisons, fourth, fifths, and octaves. There's only so much you can do. Those are beautiful intervals, but there's only so much you can do with those. So I'm talking about this because I said music is all about dissonance and consonance. If everything were consonant, if I only played perfect intervals that sound very well together, we would all get very tired of that real quickly. But dissonance in music, when you hear two notes go together that don't really give you a settled feeling, that make you kind of long for the resolution of the dissonance, as I just showed you with the seventh. Very satisfying. If I just did this, bye. So you might say, yes, but that was an unresolved dissonance, and so it left me with sort of an incomplete feeling, maybe not the most pleasant feeling. So we embrace the dissonance as long as it is resolved quickly or eventually, okay? It's kind of like what you experience in your life. I mean, you can experience dissonance in your interactions with people. And hopefully it resolves and you can get it like worked out. And if you have a very unpleasant interaction with somebody and everybody just walks off in a huff, well, that sort of leaves you with a bad feeling, an unsettled feeling of conflict. That's really what dissonance makes us feel, is there's some kind of conflict that makes us want to resolve the conflict into a consonant interval. Simply put, I mean, that's how all this works. So, having said all of that, here's the saraband. The only final thing I'll say about it is toward the end of the saraband, Bach puts in these dissonant intervals. that passage makes us feel like, oh, something's up, something's not quite right. But right after he does that, there are two more measures or so of the saraband, and he just resolves all the conflict that he conjured up by those couple bars of dissonance. So, and he kind of says to us, in the end, it'll all be okay. Okay. As promised, it all resolves in the end of the saraband. Just as I was playing it, I was becoming really aware of all the tritones that are in this piece. The forbidden diabolical interval. There's a tritone right there. Here's another one. There's another one. So, of course, they don't sound out of place. They don't make us climb the walls because we're sort of feeling safe in the hands of this master. And we know that that tritone is not going to last forever, and that there'll be a resolution of the dissonance that we encounter along the way in the saraband. So, yeah, it's kind of a good feeling. People say that in the music of Bach, there's a sense of inevitability, which is not the same, of course, as predictability. Like when you hear a piece that has the feeling of inevitability, you can kind of sometimes have the feeling like, well, of course that's the next note. That's the only note it could possibly be, and the next notes are the only ones that it could possibly be. Of course. There are all kinds of choices. And I mean, that's one of the hallmarks of a genius, I think, that they had the way of choosing exactly the right note so that you get the feeling like, of course that's the note. It's not surprising. They're not trying to be clever. They're just trying to kind of follow the muse, right? Follow the inspiration that came to them. Well, after the saraband in every suite, there are two shorter dances. In the first two suites, there are minuets. In the third and fourth suite, there are bourrées. And in the fifth and sixth suite, there are gavottes. These are all lively dances, and there's a pair of them in each one of these suites. Every one of the movements of each suite is in the same key. So if the suite is in C major, all the movements are in C major, except the second bourrée. The second bourrée is actually in C minor. But then you go back and you play the first bourrée again, so you end in C major. So playing in C major for 20 minutes, this might be really uninteresting. Because one of the things that we love about classical music is the fact that it modulates, or it changes key. So it may start out in C major, but then it goes into G major for a while, or D major, or whatever, some other key. And then you work your way back to home base at the end, and you get back to the home key. Of course, Bach does this in all these pieces. He doesn't just sit stubbornly in the key of C major for the entire suite, but it is a challenge playing a whole suite like this, because you could get tired of C major and say, oh man, another movement in C major. But each movement has its own distinct character. So far, I've played 4 of the movements. The prelude is kind of a world unto itself. The Allemande is kind of a happy, sort of bouncy movement. And then the Courante has drive and all kinds of energy. The saraband is like an island of serenity, and in many ways in the middle of the suite. So if you really explore the character of all the movements, then you don't get tired of C major. The people listening to the whole suite also won't feel like it's tedious. That, oh, another movement in C major. So the beginning of this first bourrée is another one of those pieces that when I was really young and trying to play it, I thought all these notes were part of the melody. Excellent notes. It works that way. But Casals said, that's not all the tune. He said, this is the tune. It's just that voice doesn't continue because you're playing another voice. So Casals would play softer, the answer. That's way more interesting. So it sounds like there's a melody on the top, and then there's an answer from a different voice, instead of everything being equal. And I think the challenge and the joy of getting to know these Bach suites over the course of many, many years is you keep finding opportunities to see that there are different voices in it. And maybe with your own imagination, experimenting, or in the case I just showed you, with the masterful advice from somebody like Casals, saying, you know, this is in there. You could bring that out, and you could play around with that. And then, if you're open to it, then it becomes fun, and you discover things. Thank you. So that first bourrée is such a great piece that it's been transcribed for tons of other instruments. Little tiny Suzuki violinists would play that piece, and I've heard it on tuba and saxophone, guitar, of course, and yeah, it's just that good a piece that everybody wants to play it. So no problem with borrowing from other instruments. And as I said the other night, Bach wouldn't have minded. Bach didn't say, no, that's only a cello piece. You know, you can't play that on the viola, or you can't play that on the keyboard. Some people harmonize the pieces, and like, I don't know if you've ever heard any of these cello suites for guitar, but guitarists like to play them too. And of course, they can play more chords on the guitar because they have 6 strings and everything. So they fill in the harmonies. There's even an arrangement of some of these Bach cello suite pieces that Schumann made that has a piano accompaniment, which is fine. It's lovely, but I also kind of feel like there's something perfect about the way he actually wrote it, just using the notes that the cello is able to handle and convey, yeah? So, before I play the jig, I'm wondering if anybody has any questions at this point. Yes?
So, in terms of your students and having them find their own voice, do you give them examples like you're giving us, or how do they approach it with a clean slate? I'm sure they've heard you and other things, but how is that for them?
Well, so the question is, with my students, how do I approach these pieces with them? Do I give them examples of the kind that I'm showing you tonight? Or do I just stay quiet and let them kind of figure it out? Of course, I try to show them some of these things that I'm showing you tonight. And I also encourage them to listen to the great artists who have played these pieces. When I was growing up, before I could possibly play them, I listened to Pablo Casals playing the suites. Then I listened to Pierre Fournier, wonderful, wonderful cellist. And then János Starker, his recordings too. Those were mainly the 3 people that I listened to, and they all played the suites very differently from each other. So it's dangerous to listen too much to one of these recordings, because then you can just start copying. And copying, even though it's a good thing to copy, you want to find your own way of doing it. So it really depends on the gifts and the tendencies of my student, how I approach it with them. First of all, you have to get your house in order and be able to play all the notes in tune, in the right rhythm, with a decent sound. And as I've said before, once you do that, if you just do that, it's boring, and the piece doesn't sound that interesting. So that's the first step, which is very challenging, to play in tune and with a nice sound and good rhythm. But once you do that, then you have to start trying to interpret the thing and experiment. Use your imagination. So if I have a student who's technically advanced but is not using any imagination, I will encourage them to just try something. Just do anything, but just play the notes one after another the same. And you may decide, no, that's a bad idea, but at least you're trying something. So it's trial and error. And I think that for any musician, that's the process you go through, is looking for a more interesting way. And what seemed like a good way 5, 10 years ago maybe doesn't seem like a great way now. And so, yeah, that's why it's nice to live long enough that you can live with some of these suites for a long time and change your approach. Any other questions?
Yes, please.
Yes.
Do you talk about inevitability? Do you see any coherence inside the suite, except besides this in the same key? That it seems like, of course, this chorale will come after this all along. Do you see anything like that?
I notice some kind of coherence, a cohesive quality among the movements of the suite? Or is it just the fact that they all happen to be in C major? Of course, there is a wonderful connective tissue that runs through all of these movements. And the more I listen to music, if I listen to a symphony by a great genius like Mozart, I used to think a symphony is 3 or 4 movements that were written around the same time by the same person, and they're just kind of, stuck together, and so then they call it a symphony. But once I got to know some of these pieces much better, you start to hear like motivic things, like there's something in this movement that it derives from that one. Well, I can't really say that there's a whole lot of that I can point out in this suite. But beyond the key that unifies all the movements, there is some kind of character of C major in all its aspects, playful, bold, and serene, and everything else within C major. So, I don't think it's an accident that Bach wrote suites and partitas. They're wonderful keyboard partitas that are also several movements basically in the same key. And they also are like big, huge works that make sense when you hear the whole thing. Yeah, that's a great question, Ann. Yeah. Well, there's one movement left. That's the Gigue. I may have played it for you the other night, a few weeks ago. And maybe I told this story that Bach's sons became really excellent composers, and a couple of his sons didn't look that favorably on their father's style or his compositions. And they said that he was hopelessly old-fashioned and stuffy. I think I told you this story. And they said, we know the way. We know the way into a new style, which they did. They sort of went into what's called the classical style now and moved out of the Baroque style. And I think I said the other night, I doubt if they ever had any familiarity with these cello suites, but in this Gigue, there are these sounds. This. So dissonant. This. It doesn't get any more dissonant than that, but of course it resolves right away, but it's a little in your face, this. So there's absolutely nothing stuffy about that, nothing old-fashioned. It's surprising, actually. It's kind of like a shock, but it's a pleasant shock. So the Gigue, of course, is the last movement in every one of the suites, and also in the keyboard partitas. They all, most of them, end with the Gigue or Giga, a fast dance in a triple meter. Also, a lot of wonderful interplay in the range to evoke the idea of multiple voices. So, any questions? You don't have to, yes.
I have one. I'm imagining that I am your Professor Starker sitting in the audience.
Uh-oh.
Commenting on, raising questions about what you just played.
So, he says he's imagining that he's Professor Starker sitting there listening to what I just played. And so you're asking me, like, what would his reaction be?
Yes.
Well, Starker appreciated discipline and order and control and a sense of proportion and really a refinement in the attack of the bow and perfect intonation, okay? All those things are sort of hallmarks of his playing. I did record that suite, and I sent it to him, and he said something nice in response to the recording. He didn't go on and on because that was not his way. In fact, one of my favorite stories is after that CD came out that had the third Bach suite on there, the CD's called Jubilatum, and I started the CD, I opened it with two movements by Francois Francoeur that I had become familiar with through a recording of his that I listened to countless times when I was 13, 14, 15, and thought I'll never be able to play that thing because the fast movement is very fast and it's a very difficult piece, but I worked really hard on it and I recorded it and I was relatively happy with how it turned out. So I sent him that CD, and then a month later or so I was in Bloomington for one of those annual celebrations, and I arrived a day early, so I was at a small dinner party, and Starker was there. Well, Starker liked to drink scotch. I normally don't drink, but whenever I was in Bloomington, I would drink scotch in his honor. In his honor, and also it would make me a little more comfortable, maybe. So I got so comfortable at this dinner party that Starker said something nice to me about the CD. And I said, can I ask you something? The Francoeur that I recorded at the beginning of the CD, do you hear yourself when you listen to that recording I made? Starker looked at me and said, well, it's in tune. Which was just such a perfect Starker answer because it was a compliment. It was a compliment to say it was in tune, and also he plays in tune. So in that sense, but he would never have said in a million years, oh yes, and I was so touched because I heard this. He would never say that. He just said, well, it's in tune. And I was like, okay, well that's good enough. You know, I'm very happy with that. So, yeah, who knows what, you know, you ask how he would react to what I just did. And I kind of had to laugh because the fact is, every time I pick up the cello, he's there always. He's always there. It's not that I'm thinking, what would he think of this? But I know very well what his standards were and kind of what he liked. And I try not to play the same way as he did. The Bach suite recordings that he made 5 different recordings of the Bach suites. I didn't listen to them a great deal. There were some other recordings of his that I listened to so many times that whenever I play those pieces, all I can do is try to emulate the recording. Well, if you're going to copy something, you could do worse. It's not a bad thing to try to copy, but it's just dangerous, as I said, you know. Yeah, that's a great question. Well, he's always around, you know. It's not like I ever forget about what he called the cause and also the standard, you know. I always talked about professionalism and consistency. Those were some of his bywords. He said, I have full powers available to me 24 hours a day. And I saw him once on the Today Show, live at 7 in the morning, and I was in Chicago, so he was playing Kodai Sonata, one of the hardest pieces ever written for solo cello. And it was live, and he played it absolutely flawlessly. So it was like, yep, that's true. You know, you can do that anytime, day or night, you know, regardless how early it might be. Any other questions? Yes?
When you are playing, what part of your positioning on the fingerboard is visual and what part is from touch?
The question is, when I'm playing, what part of finding the notes with my left hand are visual and what is touch or, you know, tactile muscle memory? I do look at the cello when I play, but I look at my bow usually, and it helps me concentrate. I can tell you a quick story. The first time I was ever going to perform this third Bach suite that I played for you tonight, I think I was maybe 14, and my teacher then had rented an auditorium. It was kind of a big deal, this concert. The Bach suite was one of the things on that program. And before the concert, like 2 or 3 weeks in advance, he had me do a little sort of warm-up concert in somebody's house for like 15 friends and family. Every single movement of the Bach suite, I had like 3 memory lapses and had to stop and like start over. And it was recorded on a Wallensack reel-to-reel recording. So I was like, oh no, you know, and so I suffered listening to that tape and thought, well, what am I going to do now? Because I knew the piece well, but I was a little freaked out that I was playing for 15 family and friends. And I thought, well, if I'm freaked out in the house, how am I going to be in the auditorium when I get to the concert? So then I just started practicing it with my eyes closed, just to kind of screen out who was listening and to concentrate better. And then in the recital, I played the whole suite with my eyes closed, and I didn't have any memory problems. But I was always really grateful to my teacher for having that little warm-up concert, because if he hadn't had me do that, in the actual concert, I would have had all those memory lapses. So I always suggest to my students that they try it out in advance for a smaller group of people. Yeah.
So could you have played the recital today with your eyes closed?
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. Starker used to watch people like looking for the notes up here, real high notes. It doesn't hurt to look, but Starker used to say, by the time you see it, it's too late. So it was like, no, you know, you don't really need to look. Sometimes it's reassuring to look down there and see something familiar. But yeah, that suite is all in the lower 4 positions. I never get up in the stratosphere, up high, like the first piece I played, Song of the Birds, starts way up high on the cello. So yeah, if you're just relying on your eye, you're never going to find it. You're never going to make it. So looking at the cello is helpful for concentration. Yes?
Back up to the very beginning when you opened, you talked about seeing the disassembled cello and some of the a piece in the back, I think.
Yeah, the back was a G.
There are a lot of those, especially if you're thinking of 440 as an age, then what the 11 and a half notes associated in the scale. But
question is, I mentioned that when I saw the cello dismembered, that the back of the cello, when you tapped on it, it made a G. G, it made that note. And I thought, wow, I never realized that. And that's one of the reasons that G's sound so good on the cello. There are some keys that are friendly to the instrument. C major, G major, D major. Those are all good keys because we have open strings, we have a lot of overtones like I showed you at the beginning of class. But the fourth Bach suite is in E flat major. So E flat does not have that many natural overtones on the instrument. So it's a problem actually, or an opportunity, yeah? So Starker used to say when you were playing any piece, that when you get to notes with fewer natural overtones, you have to use more vibrato to compensate for the fact that the notes don't naturally have resonance and ring. So you use a little more vibrato to decorate the sound so it sounds as good as the other notes. Yeah, because some notes sound great on the cello even with no vibrato. Well, thank you for your kind attention. I'll see you next week.